Hi, everyone. Welcome to Neighbors Together's Know Your Right session. This is an info session for anybody with a voucher who is looking for housing in New York City. We have a lot of really important information that we're going to be sharing today, and so we're really happy that you've joined us. So first thing I want to do is cover what the law says in New York City, because believe it or not, if you have a voucher and you're looking for housing, there are actually laws that protect you in New York City when you're looking for housing. And so before we even get into that, I just want to define discrimination so that we all have an understanding of what we mean when we're talking about that. So discrimination means treating a person unfairly because of who they are, because of certain characteristics they have. And in New York City, the human rights law protects specific groups of people from discrimination. So some of these groups include race, gender, disability, age, etc. There are dozens of protected classes, which means it's illegal in New York City to discriminate against somebody because of these characteristics. In housing specifically, the human rights law protects people from discrimination based on their job, the way that they make their money, the presence of children. You cannot be turned away from an apartment because you have kids. Their status as a victim of domestic violence, stalking, or sex offenses. And importantly, and what we're going to be talking about a lot today, is because of their lawful source of income. So what that means, what is a lawful source of income? A lawful source of income is any federal, state, or city subsidy, rental assistance program, or voucher. That includes Section 8, FEPS, city FEPS, HASA, Social Security Disability, public assistance, the GI Bill, a one-shot deal. All of these are considered lawful sources of income, and they're all different ways that people can pay their rent. So that means that in New York City, it's illegal for a landlord or broker to deny you an apartment because you're using a housing voucher. And yes, this happens all the time. This type of discrimination is called source of income discrimination, and we're working to end it.
So now we're going to just talk about the basics of source of income discrimination. So when you are interacting with a broker, typically they're the ones who are going to discriminate. They're the ones who are more face fronting, the ones who are listed on apartment advertisements and whatnot. However, landlords are actually the ones who are breaking the law, and they're the ones that we're going to sort of go after when we are reporting source of income discrimination. In the case of source of income discrimination, bigger buildings are better, and we're going to focus on that a little bit more and explain a bit more later on in the presentation. And it's important to note that source of income discrimination looks and sounds different to a lot of different people. And so it's just important to know what counts as discrimination so that you are aware going forward. So now we're just Okay, so we're gonna just continue talking about the basics of source of income discrimination. So the law states that if a landlord owns a building with 6 or more units, they cannot deny you an apartment based on the lawful source of income you have. So that means that includes a voucher. They also cannot refuse to accept payments from that lawful source of income. And lastly, they can't advertise that they won't accept vouchers. That is also considered illegal.
And so what's important to note here is that this law only applies to landlords who own buildings with 6 or more units. So if you're applying to a small home that has 2 units and maybe the landlord lives, in the top or bottom unit, it's very likely that this law won't apply to them, and that landlord can actually legally deny your voucher. That's why we always say, just to be safe, look for units in bigger buildings, because we know that the law applies to those landlords, and we know that there's something we can do about it if they turn your voucher away.
Okay, so here are just a couple of examples of interactions you might have with brokers, things that they might say to you when you are telling them that you have a voucher. So to start off, we're just gonna go through some really clear forms of discrimination that are really obvious. So that includes this landlord won't accept vouchers, very clear cut. We only accept Section 8, your city voucher won't work here. Then it gets a little bit more complicated. They'll say things like maybe I want my security deposit in cash, otherwise I can't work with you. I will accept your voucher, but only if you pay me extra under the table. Then it gets to be a little bit more discreet, saying things like, let me get back to you, I have to check with the landlord. This unit is no longer available and I have nothing else in that price range. And this is something, the last one is something that a lot of people experience. Sometimes a broker just straight up won't respond to you over email or text once you mention your voucher. And that happens all the time.
And all of these are forms of discrimination, right? Sometimes it's really obvious and other times it's really not obvious. So what we want to make sure you all know is when you are getting discriminated against, because there's something that you can do about it. And we're going to be talking about that later. Here are two other really obvious ways that landlords and brokers discriminate. So one is they'll say, you do not meet the minimum income requirement. So that is something that does not apply to voucher holders. If you see something like, oh, you must make 40 times the rent, or you must have an income that's $75,000 or more, that does not apply to you. And so if a broker says you can't apply to this apartment because you don't meet that income requirement, you know that that's illegal. Credit is another thing that brokers and landlords will use against voucher holders. They'll say that you don't meet their credit requirements. And this is illegal on a case-by-case basis. So what that means is if your voucher covers the full rent, you don't pay a portion, right? Your voucher is going to pay the full $1,268 or the full $1,580. Your credit score cannot be used against you. Your credit score is effectively eliminated from your application. And so if a broker says you can't apply to this apartment because you don't meet the credit requirement, you know that that's illegal and that's discrimination. If you do pay a portion of the rent, right? You pay 30% of your income and it goes towards your rent. Your credit score is a factor, but it's not the only factor. And so what we would want you guys to look out for is if a broker says you can't apply to an apartment because you are 10 points below their credit requirement. That to us sounds fishy and that sounds like discrimination and something that we would want to look into. Now, if your credit score falls 200 points below their credit requirement, that might be something that's a little bit harder for us to argue. And so we do have some tips later on about how to avoid the credit question in general.
So when it comes to reporting, this is how Neighbors Together, our organization, helps to get people with vouchers housing. This is how we hold landlords and brokers accountable and work towards ending source of income discrimination. So that's why we really are honing in on the reporting aspect, because without reporting, it's really difficult to hold landlords and brokers accountable for what they're doing.
Right. And you know, it's important to know that source of income discrimination has been illegal in New York City for 12 years now. But there's a reason that landlords and brokers still do it all the time. It's because they don't see any consequence to turning away people with vouchers. So by reporting, we're holding these people accountable and we are making it known that you need to accept vouchers if you are going to be a landlord or a broker in New York City.
So the most important thing to remember is that you must have evidence of your conversations with brokers. So every single time that you're making contact with a broker, you have a couple of options in order to record your evidence. So first, you could record the phone call, which by the way is legal. In order to record the phone call, it can be a little tricky sometimes, but ways you can do it are you can either download an app on your phone that will record your phone calls, or you can put your phone on speakerphone, and if you have another device in your vicinity in your household, like a tablet or someone else's phone or a computer, then you can put your phone on speakerphone and then record from that other device. If that's not possible, that's totally fine. You can also just opt to text or email with the broker, and that way it's really easy to collect a paper trail of evidence. That way you can just take screenshots of the conversations and it's much more straightforward in that way.
Right. And I know Miriam said this, but I'm going to repeat her. You must have evidence. Because if we don't have evidence, it's your word against theirs, and there's not much that we can do to prove that they discriminated. If you have the evidence, we've cornered that landlord or broker, and they can't deny what they said because we have it right there.
Right. So if you do have evidence of discrimination, you can go to the website stopsidnyc.com. So that's stopsidnyc.com. And on there, there's a button that says report SID. So SID stands for Source of Income Discrimination. So on that site, you press the button that says report SID, and that way you can submit all your evidence and all the information. The timing is really important because, as I'm sure you're all aware, the New York City housing market is really fast-paced. Sometimes you might find an apartment one day, and then you might wait even a couple of days to send us the evidence, and the apartment might be completely off the market, already leased out to somebody else. So the same day or even the same second that you experience discrimination, you should be sending us that evidence, because the sooner you report, the faster we can act on it.
So what happens if a broker just ignores your texts or your emails or your calls after you tell them you have a voucher? If a broker ghosts you, that's when they stop answering after you tell them you have a voucher. You should 100% report the conversation as soon as you realize that they're no longer responding. Why? Because that's a form of discrimination, and we'll help you prove that they're discriminating. So what we'll do is we'll run something called a control test. We'll reach out to the same exact broker in the same exact way, except instead of saying that we have a voucher, we'll say that we're making $75,000 a year. They really like that type of income. We'll say that, and we'll see if the broker decides to respond to us and not respond to the person with the voucher. So I'm going to show you guys an example. This was one of our members who reached out about an apartment at 1720 Nostrand Avenue. The broker responded, asked some questions, and when the broker asked what's the income and how's the credit, our member said, I'm a full-time student and I have a voucher which covers 100% of the rent. To that, he got no response. So he sent us a screenshot of this conversation, and we ran a control test. We reached out to the same exact broker and asked about the same exact apartment. The broker asked the same questions to us as he did to our member. And when it came to how's the income and how's the credit, we said we make $75,000 a year and our credit score was good last time we checked. We kept it vague. And the broker responded immediately, 2 minutes later, and said, great, when would you like to see the apartment? We now had evidence against this broker that they were responding to people if they said they made cash income, and they were ignoring people if they said that they had a voucher. That's enough evidence to prove that the broker is discriminating. And we actually reported this, and this member is now in the process of moving into this apartment at 1720 Nostrand Avenue. If you have a friend or somebody else in your family who has a phone and is interested in helping out, you can actually run these control tests yourself. You can test the broker and see if they respond to another person who says that they have an income, like a cash income. And if you do that, you can send us both conversations as evidence and we can report even faster. If you don't have anybody who can help you do this, we are always happy to do it for you. The important thing, like Miriam said, is that you report to us quickly if the broker stops answering, because the longer you wait, the less likely we are to be able to get that unit. So we just gave you guys a ton of information on what source of income discrimination is, how to identify it, and how to report it. There are also some really useful tips that we want to give you about how to do your housing search that will help you in the process of looking for an apartment. So one of the really important things is that we really want to emphasize, please, please, please do not apply directly to real estate agencies. Don't call Nooklyn or Exit Realty and tell them, I'm looking for an apartment and I have a voucher. Why? Because they're going to give you the runaround, they're going to waste your time, and it's going to be really, really hard for us to prove that they're discriminating. Real estate agencies can be really discreet with what units they have available. So we actually never know if they're telling the truth when they say they have nothing available for you or they're lying. A lot of times also, we're not going to have exact addresses. So we're not going to be able to know if that building is big enough to have to follow the laws. And so it's just a really inefficient way to look for housing. And what we recommend instead is to use websites like Apartments, StreetEasy, Trulia, and Zumper. These websites are listing available units, so you can actually see the address and you know that that unit is available to people. That makes a huge difference when we're trying to report discrimination. So when you're using these websites, you're going to want to stay within your voucher limit. You can set filters on the websites to weed out apartments that are above your voucher amount. And again, we emphasize record all of your communications with brokers. Any emails you send, any text messages you send, any calls you make sure that you are getting a recording of all of them.
So next, we're just going to talk about another option for your housing searches. If you're not familiar with it, there is something called New York City Housing Connect. So Housing Connect is the affordable housing lottery that's provided through the city. You can make a profile for yourself on the website, and we have it linked here. If you have a voucher, that is so important to include in your profile. And that is because on Housing Connect, if your voucher covers the rent and you're the appropriate family size, then you automatically are qualified for that apartment. It is a lottery system. I just want to reiterate that. So it doesn't mean that just because your voucher covers the rent, that means you'll automatically be granted that apartment. It just means that you are qualified and you can be chosen for that apartment. And if you are chosen, then you are automatically qualified because of your voucher. Another thing to note is that when you're inputting your income information on the site, you should not add up your monthly voucher amount as your yearly income. This is just misleading, and it's just important to indicate you have a voucher. There's a separate section for that on the site, and I know it can be a little bit confusing. So if you have any questions about it, we're going to be including my email at the end of this slideshow. So you can always contact me or one of the other staff at Neighbors Together to assist you with setting up your profile.
And thank you, Miriam. And we want to be clear that even though Housing Connect is through the city, there are still landlords on Housing Connect that will discriminate against vouchers. And so if you think you've been unfairly disqualified from a lottery, you can always forward us that email as evidence. And we'll look into it and make sure that you actually didn't meet any of the qualifications that they were listing. So we'll basically just double check that that was a legal denial and not an illegal denial. Talking tips. So there's also really important ways to structure conversations when you're talking to brokers so that we can catch them discriminating. So for example, when you start a conversation with a broker, you don't want to immediately mention your voucher. You want to instead start with a question like, "Hi, I'm interested in this unit. Is it available?" If you immediately mention your voucher, you kind of close the conversation off from the start. And we want the broker to kind of answer so that we have some sort of conversation before they discriminate. So you say the unit's available, but when you ask if the unit's available, but when the broker asks about income and credit, now is the time to mention your voucher. You do not want to add up your monthly voucher amount to come to a yearly total like Miriam said. Why? Because if you never mention your voucher, then we can't claim that that broker discriminated against your voucher. If you just give them a yearly total of, oh, my income is $30,000 a year because you've added your voucher, they're going to deny you because your income's too low, and we can't claim that that's source of income discrimination. So when the broker asks about income, that's when you mention your voucher. If your credit is low and they ask you about credit, just skip the question. You don't have to answer it. Instead, you can just say, "I'm using a voucher." If they're stuck on the credit question and they keep asking, you can just say, "I'm not entirely sure, but it was good last time I checked." You can keep it really vague because legally they can't require you to answer that question. And if they stop answering you because you won't give them a direct answer, you should absolutely report to us because we can intervene.
So that's kind of it for this presentation. If you have any more questions or you want more information, you can email me at my email. It's just miriam@neighborstogether.org. So that's spelled MIRIAM at neighbors, NEIGHBORS together, TOGETHER.org. So yeah, and I'm always happy to set up a time to talk on the phone or email back and forth for any questions you have.
And lastly, I just want to mention that besides, helping report discrimination, we have been organizing to end source of income discrimination and make vouchers better for all of the people that use them. So we have monthly campaign meetings, and we're having our meeting this Thursday, August 13th at 6 p.m. on Zoom. You can register the same way you registered for this meeting at bit.ly/value in all caps in housing. And I'll send out an email reminder to everybody that was at this training. But we need to come together to fix vouchers because they have a lot of potential to help people find housing. But right now they are really, really hard to use in New York City. And we want to make them better. And we can only do that if we are all coming together and saying the same things. That's the only way elected officials are going to respond. So I hope to see you all there. And without further ado, we will take questions. So thank you guys for being